appreciate your feedback, so do keep them coming. Engage with us on the socials at KTN News KE, at the Jesse Rogers, using the hashtag Newsline. Our conversation tonight is centered on the state of the economy. We'll be taking a look at the facts and the figures and asking why exactly are these good numbers on paper not translating to your pocket in the common Kenyan household. I'm joined in studio by Kiplimo Kigen. He's the head of policy research and advocacy at the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And virtually, we're equally joined by Professor Exeni Raki. He's an economic analyst and lecturer at the University of Nairobi. He's joining us from Hamburg, Germany. That conversation is coming your way after this short break, so do stay with us. We'll be back at the top of the hour at exactly 10 p.m.
You are what you drink. Drink the best, made from 100% fruit with no added sugar or preservatives. Del Monte, real recognized real.
Well, in that case, I'll have whatever he's having.
I drink responsibly. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Del.
Del who?
Del Monte.
Real recognized real. No added sugar, no preservatives. 100% real fruit.
Welcome to iVibe Africa, your best African entertainment platform. Discover exclusive content on African culture, motoring, sports, and reality shows made by Africans for Africa. Stream to iVibe Africa wherever you are. Whether you're at home or on the go, we've got something for you. Download iVibe Africa now on Google App Store or Play Store to ensure you never miss out on this captivating and amazing entertainment. Dental tips, brought to you by Sensodyne. Brush your tongue. Your tongue holds bacteria like a sponge. Whenever you brush your teeth, don't forget to brush your tongue. You can use your toothbrush for this purpose.
Sensodyne gives you long-lasting protections against sensitivity. And people come in and they're like, oh, it works. I can have ice cream and I'm not in any discomfort. I recommend Sensodyne because it works. It's brilliant.
Gongo Jehova, Gongo Jehova, Gongo Jehova. Hii mchezo wa daka na mamili niliona kwa TV. So nikachukua simu yangu, nikaenda kwa lipa na M-Pesa, nikaweka 440440, alafu nikatuma. So nikaambiwa mimi ni mshindi wa shilingi 250. So nikafurahi sana, nikaita familia yangu, tukasherekea. Tukashukuru Mungu. So hiyo pesa nitalipia fees na nitaongeza ukulima.
Enda kwenye paybill 440440. Account KTN. Amount cheza na shilingi 20 hadi shilingi 2,000 na ushinde mamilioni. Dakamita kuwa bingwa.
Welcome back and thank you for staying with Newsline. It's exactly 10 p.m. Let's shift focus to our conversation where we will touch base with matters to do with the economy. A lot has been said. You've definitely seen the figures from the government. A little bit earlier on, we highlighted our public debt stock, which is roughly at 10.6 trillion Kenya shillings. What does this translate to in terms of how the economy is performing? So much to talk about, so little time. Allow me to introduce my guest once again. Kiplimo Kigen is joining me in studio. He's the head of policy research and advocacy at KNCCI. That's the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Kenya. And we're equally joined by Professor Exeni Raki virtually from Hamburg, Germany. He's an economics analyst and lecturer at the University of Nairobi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the latest outlook. Inflation is at 2.7%, down from 9.2%. That was in September 2022. Fuel prices are down 6.7% for diesel and 4.3% for petrol. Exchange rate has improved, and we'd heard from the government it is now at 127 Kenya shillings to the US dollar compared to 158 a while back as the Kenya Kwanza administration was coming into office. So needless to say, there has been gains that have been made by the current administration. But despite these gains, there is tension between government revenue needs and public tolerance. Let's start with you, Keegan, just briefly. What good, bad, and ugly can you highlight in this administration's management of the economy in the past 2 years?
Thank you for having me, Jesse. I think in the last 2 years, we've seen some really key events, both that can be expected and those that cannot be expected, like the floods and some political tensions, the mandamanos and all. Yes. But overall, I'd say that you mentioned inflation coming down to around 2.7%, 2.9%. Coming off of COVID, during COVID, and even the shocks with the war in Ukraine and some of the tensions that we've seen in the Gulf region, I think many central banks really underestimated the impact of that and how slowly the economy would come back. So we had that rise in inflation, which was not just unique to Kenya, but also across the globe. Now, inflation has started going down, and not just in Kenya, again, across the world. But something that we need to remember is that inflation is a rate. So now that it's down to sub 3%, it doesn't mean that the prices of goods are not increasing. Okay. It just means that they're increasing at a slower rate. But speaking from the private sector point of view, we have a report from the Chamber of Commerce called the Business Barometer. It's a quarterly survey that we run across businesses, both members and non-members of the Chamber. So for Q4, we spoke to more than 1,200 businesses across the country in all sectors. And we asked them, what do you think Q4 is going to be like? And we asked them different issues. What are your expectations on revenue? What are your expectations on staff size? Majority of the businesses said that they're not looking to hire in Q4. When we asked them about the primary cost of inputs, these measures the cost of doing business, essentially the raw materials, the primary cost of inputs. And 54% mentioned that they do not expect the primary cost of inputs to drop. So what we are hearing from the private sector in as far as the cost of inputs is concerned is a totally different case from the 2.9, 2.7% that we are seeing on inflation. Okay. So the cost of inputs are still going up. Then that means that the output, what will be produced, what you find in the shelves and in the shops and on the retail space is still high. So there is a mismatch on that front.
Interesting. Exeni Raki, as you come in, because inflation has gone down, prices of commodities have gone down. According to the government, sugar price has decreased by 2.3%, maize flour by 1.8%, electricity costs reduced by 7% for industrial users, just to name a few. It seems like we're looking at a paradox of falling prices in a broke economy. Why is it that Kenyans don't have money in their pockets, yet we're looking at good figures in the economic outlook that is barely being felt in the Kenyan household? How come?
I think that's a very legitimate question to ask, because one of the big news that has been hitting the Kenyan headlines in the last 1 month or so is that inflation is down. And if you remember when Kenya Kwanza government came to power, they promised that the inflation will go down, the cost of living will go down. But I think it's more complex than that, because we should be asking what is bringing down inflation. I think my colleague has said that it is not that the prices are not going up, but they are going up at a decreasing rate. But there are a number of factors why inflation is going down. And then we can also ask, should we celebrate that or not celebrate that? One is that if you look at the two drivers of inflation, one of them is the price of fuel. And because of the slowing demand of oil, particularly in China, then the price of oil is not rising as fast as expected. And that is having a positive effect on inflation. In other words, inflation is going down because the price of oil globally is going down. Number two is, if you look at the Kenyan economy in the last 1 year or two, there has been very good rains. There have been bump harvest. And one of the big drivers of inflation happens to be the price of food. So if there is plenty of food, then the price of food does not go up. So these two have played a role in making sure that there is no inflation. But there's even a bigger, more factor, which I have always insisted that Kenyans have no money. If you have no money, then there's no demand for goods and services, and by extension, inflation goes down. Now, somebody might ask, where has the money gone? I think the money has gone to two places. One of them is with taxes. All of you can remember your pay slips. If you check your pay slip, the government has taken more and more money from you. By extension, you have no money to buy goods and services, and that brings down inflation. The other money has been taken up by the government, which is borrowing. You look at the interest rates, they have gone up. So if the interest rates have gone up, we don't want to borrow the money. We don't want to borrow the money for investing or for consumption, then inflation goes down. So there's a multiplicity of factors that is making inflation go down. Some of them are good, others are not very good. But should we celebrate that? If there is inflation, if the inflation is going down, it probably also shows that the economy is not growing as fast as expected. Because if the economy is growing very fast, then there's demand for goods and services. And that is reflected by the rising prices. It is good in one way, not good in the other way.
Okay, well noted, Prof. Back to Keegan right here. I came across an article recently, and this byline stuck with me. The government is on a campaign of a positive narrative. Yet when positivity is the reality, you don't need a narrative. So why exactly, according to you, don't we feel the impact, the positive outlook that is projected on paper? Why is it not translating to our pockets, briefly?
First of all, on the issue of fuel and electricity.
Yes.
So macroeconomics is really a game of time. So if we even look at the cost of fuel in the last 5 years, the cost of fuel in 2019, much closer to 100 shillings compared to today. Obviously, a number of factors concerned. But from the business side, the cost of fuel and the cost of electricity, which are key inputs in the production of goods and services, are still significantly higher compared to those of our neighbors. Now, we do not exist in an island, right? We are in a common market. And the global market is all about competition. So I don't think we should be celebrating because we're not yet out of the woods. The day we can begin to even imagine a celebration is when we are now competitive, even to our neighbors. Because if it's still way cheaper to produce in Uganda and Tanzania and so on and so forth, then we are nowhere close to the celebration. But the question that you've asked on when things are good and the government is on an agenda, I believe that's politically, it's politically sort of like motivated, just given what the country went through with the protest and the government feeling that they needed to really communicate their wins. But I think more effort should be put on the actual work, perhaps, than on the other side. You mentioned the issue of debt earlier on. And one of the key concerns for the private sector is that the government also owes the private sector, the same way they owe the counties money that has not been disbursed.
Okay.
One of our appeals has been, if the government can pay the pending bills, they would unlock immense value for the country. We've got about 700 billion Kenya shillings in unpaid pending bills from both the national and the county governments. One of the most profitable companies in East and Central Africa, Safaricom, is almost getting to 600 billion Kenya shillings in value. So if we were to pay the pending bills, we'd unlock value more than the value of Safaricom in the economy. And in as much, we understand that currently there is a debt trap, if I could use that word. So the private sector is also being owed the same way, and that has caused a lot of challenges because huge working capital constraints, so many businesses have died because of it, so many businesses have had to fire people just because of the item on pending bills, which is a huge concern. And also on the issue of counties not getting their disbursement on time, there is another angle. You find that workers who work for the county governments, when their salaries are delayed and they can't earn money, aside from it being a moral issue, their tendency to go the kitu kidogo kind of way is higher than, if they were fairly and compensated on time. Yeah. So those are just some of the issues that we are seeing on that front, and we'll obviously talk more about the debt.
Definitely. As you come in, Iraqi, let's talk about this issue of debt. And I'd like your take on the administration's handling of public debt, because we've seen efforts around, is it fiscal consolidation and improved revenue collection? We've seen the debt to GDP ratio sort of stabilize, though it's still a major concern, it being over 65%. How do we get to the approved anchor of a 55% debt to GDP ratio? Is it even a reality, bearing in mind our financial constraints as a country?
I think the last time I checked the Kenyan news, I saw the parliament trying to say that they want to keep the president unfettered power to go beyond the statutory range of 55% out of the GDP. But I think the best way to stop borrowing, there are two ways I see it. One of them is reduce your expenditure. And of course, that has consequences, because if you reduce the government expenditure, you may have to have some people going home, being laid off. But the other one is to stop waste. We have always been complaining that, and that is common knowledge in the public domain, that corruption has been a problem. So if we reduce corruption, if we made sure that we lived within our means, then probably there would be no need of borrowing. But the other solution, which is very unpalatable, I think the government doesn't want to shout very loudly, is if you raise the taxes, then you can reduce the need for the government to borrow. But either side, whether you reduce when you increase the taxes to reduce borrowing, then there are political consequences, and that is the fine line that the government is riding on. That we can reduce borrowing by raising the taxes, but people will not be very happy. If you remember, one of the reasons why people demonstrated on the streets of Nairobi is because of higher taxes. So that's probably why you are saying earlier that the government is coming up with a narrative, making people feel good that things are improving. And if you remember when Kibaki was in power, that's what he did before he increased the taxes. Najivunia kuwa Mkenya. So if we can feel good, it will probably be easier to deal with taxes. And I think my colleague should also have mentioned something a bit earlier before we go on, that the government also increased, not the government, but the CBK increased the interest rates, if you remember. And when you increase the interest rate, one of the consequences is that you reduce the inflation. So that we should have mentioned that area. And finally, I want to find out, and I would be very happy to know, when you say that the government debt has reached 10.6 trillion, does that include the ROCO debt that my colleague mentioned, debt owed to suppliers and contractors? I think we need to have a very clear information on what that 10.6 trillion is all about, because I agree with my colleague. Once you pay those debts, you unlock a lot of economic potential.
Yeah, and it equally brings in the issue of orders, debts, and whatnot. I'd like your take, Prof. Iraqi, just briefly, on this reintroduction of 8 new tax measures from that controversial Finance Bill 2024 that was shot down. We've heard from the Treasury CS, John Badi, where he said the new bills would spur economic growth and assist in bridging the fiscal deficit through enhanced revenue collection. But there's equally a school of thought out there that, these new taxes are piling pressure on an already struggling population that is struggling with the high cost of living. What's your take on the reintroduction of this new 8 tax measures?
I think I've always been a very big fan of laugh as scarf, that there's an optimal tax rate that gives us the highest tax revenues. So sometimes when the economy is not doing very well, like the rate is not doing very well, one of the best stimulus measures has always been to reduce the tax rates. And we have done that in the past. If you remember, during COVID-19, the tax rates were reduced, and we did the tax revenues did not go down. So I think because of pressure from IMF and from other quarters, the government won't raise more taxes or more tax revenues, but it might be counterproductive, because once people are taxed at a certain rate, then you stop raising more tax revenues. So the government needs to get that balance between using tax to raise more revenues, but also remembering that depresses the economy in certain ways.
Okay, well noted. So again, an increase in And taxes does not necessarily mean an increase in collections as well. What's your take on those 8 tax measures that are set to be consolidated into 3 new bills and to be tabled in Parliament? Are we better off, especially in the private sector, following their reintroduction?
Yeah, so just allow me to tie that with the budget review and outlook statement that was recently published by the National Treasury. This speaks to the outlook, essentially, of the 2025-2026 financial year budget. Now, one of the things that I saw is that the budget is actually going to increase by 173 billion Kenya shillings. Now, many Kenyans would expect that at such a time, when we've got the debt crunch, it would make, a quick and ordinary sense that we probably reduce our budget to address that. Further, if you look at our fiscal deficit, it's supposed to increase by another 70 billion. So this demonstrates not just to stakeholders in Kenya, but also abroad, that it looks like we're just doing the same thing again and again and again and again, because we should be managing our expenses. We tend to talk a lot about the taxation side and raising the revenue, but we've got a big problem on the expenditure side, and Prof has talked about cutting expenses. And we know where a good amount of our budget goes into embezzlement and losses. So that's the hard truth that the government needs to face and focus on, because we need to live within our means, or at least demonstrate that we are moving towards living within our means by reducing the fiscal deficit. Still on that, when it comes to debt, domestic debt, we've got a big problem in private sector with government crowding out private sector when it comes to borrowing locally. Commercial banks at the moment are one of the biggest funds of infrastructure bonds, right? And there's obviously a public finance question on whether the IFBs are really going to infrastructure or to recurring expenditures. But even at that, when you've got IFBs at 16, 17, even 18% that are tax-free, then, which is relatively guaranteed, then at the end of the day, banks are businesses. They will obviously choose that over lending to MSMEs. But then that cripples the private sector. So you can't even get taxes from the supposed growth that is supposed to come from the private sector. And one of the proposals that we've been thinking about is, if we can have a cap on domestic lending, on domestic borrowing for the government, and a cap that can be followed this time round, not the other percentages that have been previously abused. Going back to the taxation side now, which is on raising the revenues, one of the appeals of the private sector is that we need a predictable tax regime. And one of the positive things that I've been hearing from the CS body is not having a finance bill every year. Because the way we've been sitting is that from the private sector, when it gets to around April, May, everyone is tense because you don't know, there's a clause that might come in the finance bill and struck you out of business. Yeah. So we need that level of predictability. And these particular bills that are now going to Parliament should reflect that predictability. And next to predictability is what we are calling for is the broadening of the tax base and not the deepening of the tax base. Because currently you have the formal sector where it's easy to tap and get more taxes because the systems are there and everything, but we've got the informal side as well. Now, the formal side has become overburdened. Even payroll, payee has become overburdened. Okay. What we need is the broadening. Let us go to those areas that are not yet taxed. Let us bring the informal sector into the fold. And obviously there's a bigger conversation on that, but that's one of the ways in which the government can raise revenue, and we hope that regulations coming on board will be able to address and stick to the predictability and the broadening of the tax base.
Okay, Raki, your take on this broadening of the tax base, because we've equally seen the challenges when it comes to the implementation of some of these statutory deductions. Talk about the housing levy, equally the social health authority through SHIF. How exactly do we bring in the informal sector to carry the burden as well? What's your take on that? How best to approach it?
I think my colleague is very right on that because as a Kenyan who is working and formerly employed, I felt the burden of the tax. If I could be around, I can tell you that I remember my NHIF moved from 1,700 Kenya shillings per month to about 9,600. That's quite a lot of money. So one of the ways to reduce the tax burden is to have it shared by more and more people. So we have more people in the informal sector paying taxes. But I think the best way to do that is to make sure that people see where the tax is going. Because I've never heard any Kenyan saying, I don't want to pay taxes. All Kenyans are willing to pay taxes. But one way to bring in the formal sector, the informal sector, and everybody to pay taxes is for people to see where the tax goes in terms of services, in terms of development products, in terms of development projects, and in terms of more jobs. Once people see that, I think it will be very easy to raise more tax revenues. But I'm also of the opinion that we should probably make it constitution that the tax, that the debt as a percentage of GDP should be maybe 55%. And the good thing about using that metric to gauge our debt is because if you want to raise more debt, then the economy must grow. And that will force our leaders to make the economy grow, make the environment very conducive, so that if you want to get more money, then grow the economy. If you keep on shifting, as my colleague has said, shifting the percentage, shifting the low number from 10.6 trillion to something else, then there will be no incentive for people to create jobs. There will be no incentives for people to grow the economy. They will just be getting money. And that is not the way to grow the economy.
Okay, Xeni Raki, thanks for that. Kigan, I'm interested in the projections around the ease of doing business in the country. What is the private sector saying? Earlier on, you mentioned what business people are saying in terms of projections in the Q4 of this financial year. How about the ease of doing business? Are we welcoming more investors with some of these policies we're putting in place, or are we chasing them away?
Thank you for that question. So first, when we ask businesses what they expect as far as revenue is concerned, majority of them, 65%, said that they expect their revenue to grow. Okay. But then, that is in October, November, and December of 2024. But then comparing this with what we've seen in Q3 and Q2, the optimism is less, and understandably so, just given what happened in Q3. Now, one of the concerns when it comes to ease of doing business is the multiplicity and duplicity of licenses that we have in Kenya. True. We've got a big problem in the counties where you're paying, a distribution tax, advertising, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. Yeah. That has become one of the biggest pain points for private sector in doing business just within Kenya. So that's one of the areas that needs to be focused on. Harmonize those taxes, make it easier. It's one, the ease, and then the cost. The other item that's affecting ease of business, and I think this is a concern that has not been raised so much, is there's currently a wedge between the formal and the informal sector. Now, where's the wedge? Okay. KRA introduced e-teams in 2023, and it has been going on. Businesses continue to uptake e-teams, though at a slower rate. The challenge that we're having today is if you're a business and you are buying if you're a formally registered business and operating in the formal sphere, let me call it that, and you are buying from the informal sector. Now, let me give you an example. One of our members in Nakuru County who makes clothing. Okay. And they sell clothing. So they buy the fabric from Eastleigh, they buy the fabric from Kamkunji, but then the traders in Eastleigh and Kamkunji have not onboarded on e-teams. Now, they are not able, you need that ETR receipt, that e-teams receipt that is going to be recognized by KRA at the end of the financial year that this is indeed your expenditure, so that when you're paying your corporate tax, you don't pay your corporate tax on the revenue, you actually pay it on the profit. Now, you'd ask, why are some of these players not onboarding on e-teams? It is a big question of trust with the government and with the revenue authority, to an extent where if you go to Kamkunji or even Eastleigh, some of the traders have actually don't want even Lipa na M-Pesa. They tell you, withdraw in this deal or give me cash, just because there's so much fear with the government and how things are handled. So I'd say there needs to be a change of approach in how the authorities interface with business people, so that it's not, they don't see it as, a threat that they're coming to fight us. So that change of approach will be very important in mobilization of revenue. If we don't unlock the trust, we don't go anywhere.
Okay, that's really proper to note. Asanteni sana for your time. We were joined virtually by Professor Ekseni Raki, an economics analyst and lecturer at the University of Nairobi. All the best as you battle the cold weather in Hamburg, Germany. We definitely appreciate your input, Professor. Asante sana for your time. And we were equally joined by Keegan, who is from the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He's the head of policy research and advocacy. Asante sana for your contributions, gentlemen. And that's how we wrap up today's edition of Newsline. So much to talk about, so little time. That's how we were able to converse some of the nitty-gritty details around the state of the economy we're currently experiencing in the country. Let's take a look at Kenya's Bold newspaper, what you'll be waking up to tomorrow on the front page of the Standard. And it sort of touches on the state of the economy, where the Fuliza gang in the 449 million shillings heist is set to lose property, where at least 10 youth registered more than 123,000 mobile phone lines. They took loans and went on a car and motorcycle buying spree without the intention of repaying the money. Well, the properties are said to be forfeited by the government. More details on page 4. Make sure you grab yourself a copy, including how thousands may miss exams over varsity funding crisis. Multiple public universities say students have been given an ultimatum to settle outstanding tuition fees before the tests begin in December. But there is no government funding until a case is heard mid-next month. More details on the state of higher education in the country, touching on public universities. More details equally and